Now, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, remember him? He's being urged to explain how he would pay for any planned tax cuts in next week's budget. Yes, the March budget is coming around finally. Joining me now to discuss this is Paul Johnson, who's director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. They held a briefing today on, well, what they think the public finances look like. Good morning to you, Paul.
Morning.
Thank you very much indeed. OK, so how bad or how good is it? What wiggle room, what space does the Chancellor have for any tax cuts in the first place?
Well, things are looking quite difficult, as everyone will have heard. It looks like we went into recession towards the end of last year. The economy isn't growing, and we're spending an enormous amount on debt interest. We've got such a big debt at the moment that we're spending more than we've ever done before, actually, on just servicing that debt. So put those things together, and there's not a lot of space to cut taxes unless you can find some way of cutting spending. And I think the thing that we're concerned about is that the Chancellor has happily said that he wants to cut taxes, and he has laid out some spending plans which imply that some areas of spending will be cut, but he's not told us where he intends to make those cuts. And I think if you're going to be honest about these things, if you're going to cut the taxes, you need to tell us what the consequences of that will be, and whether it's social care or justice or prisons or the police or whatever it is that you're going to cut to make up for that.
And that goes for all parties, doesn't it? And we'll see as we approach the general election, as and when it's called, more and more pressure on Labour Party as well to say, you know, give some more specifics about what they want to do. And this is reality. With the debt payments as they are at the moment and the interest payments, there isn't really the scope for any more borrowing. If you're going to do tax cuts, so less money coming into Treasury coffers, you're going to have less money going out. So that does mean spending cuts. And yet we know that spending in real terms is going to be cut for a lot of departments anyway, isn't it? Simply because of the rising cost of things like minimum wage, the cost of energy, the cost of pretty much everything for, you know, wage rises for teachers, NHS workers, etc. All of those people are costing more, all those services are costing more already. So we're going to be getting less for the same amount of money anyway.
Well, exactly. And you're right about both those things. On the sort of spending on the borrowing side, the problem is that both Jeremy Hunt and Rachel Reeves from the Labour Party say they want to get debt down over time. And you can't have it rising forever. If you want to get debt down over time, then there is not scope for more borrowing in the medium term. So that's one problem. And on the other side, we're you know, for example, the government committed to a huge thing last June called the NHS Workforce Strategy. That alone is going to cost tens of billions of pounds. We probably need more doctors and nurses and so on the NHS. So that is very
But it needs
expensive.
To be paid for. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So all these things need to be paid for. So there is more money going out the door.
And in terms of tax cuts, we know there's been a lot of talk about inheritance tax being cut. It's very unpopular tax, but actually it impacts a tiny, tiny minority of people. Though interesting, by the way, not the very rich. They just bypass that altogether with their trust funds and things, don't they? Take their wealth abroad. So it's really a tax on sort of people who've just done pretty well rather than the very, very rich. But a lot of talk now about national insurance cuts. But it's very confusing for a lot of us because we saw national insurance rise, did we not? We've seen tax thresholds being kept where they were, which have seen millions more people dragged into higher and higher rates of tax or into tax at all at the lowest end. And then we're sort of seeing national insurance cuts and possible again. But overall, aren't we still all going to be worse off than we were at the start of all of this?
I'm afraid so. And again, that's you got that exactly right. So taxes
the
are
economics
rising.
Degree is paid off, finally.
Excellent. Taxes are rising. They're rising a lot. Exactly as you say, the point at which you start to pay income tax has been frozen for a number of years, whilst inflation has been quite high. That's dragging lots more people into tax. And actually, at the end of this parliament, taxes are going to be much higher than they were at the beginning, irrespective of what the Chancellor does next week. Nevertheless, he's looking for, that's part of the reason why he's looking for some way of getting taxes down. Taxes are at a very high level by British historic standards, partly because we're paying for all that debt interest and the health service and so on. So even that we did have a 2p cut in national insurance back in January. It's not obvious that the government's got any great political benefit from doing that. I would say that if you're going to cut national insurance or income tax, I think there is a very good case for making it on national insurance. That only affects people of working age in work. and they're actually the group who have probably struggled most over the last 15 years. So if you're going to cut one of those, I would go for the national insurance cut.
Yeah, exactly. An income tax cut, well, it will also benefit people who are just living off investments, people who are retired as well. The likes of Liz Truss and others on that side of the Conservative Party have said, look, we need tax cuts. Tax Institute of Economic Affairs and others, tax cuts are going to grow our economy. The one thing we've not done for years and years, decades even, is properly grow our economy. And tax cuts is the way to do it. Do you agree? And if so, what taxes?
Well, lower taxes are better than higher taxes. But as we saw a couple of years ago when Liz Truss was Prime Minister briefly, if you cut taxes big time without any plan for what you're doing on spending, you really scare the markets. You end up in big economic trouble. So there are lots of things we ought to do to improve growth. Certainly, we need to reform the planning system. We need to reform the further education system. We need to build more infrastructure. We need a close trade relationship with a whole bunch of countries, including the European Union. We need to sort out a lot of the regulations and so on. And there are some taxes, actually. If you really want to get growth going by cutting taxes, or first on my list actually would be stamp duty. I mean, that is a terrible tax. It causes lots of problems in the housing market, which itself causes lots of problems in the labour market and for growth. There are definitely changes you need to make, further changes you need to make to the corporation tax system, and a whole series of things that you could do to national insurance, including actually customs. So there are cuts that you can make to the tax system which are helpful, but you do need to be very clear about how you're going to manage the public finances at the same time and as part of a much broader growth strategy. And the thing we haven't had for a long period is that broader growth strategy. And final thing, what you can't
very quickly, sorry, we've got about 30 seconds left. Oh, I've lost. We'll leave it there, Paul. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much indeed, Paul Johnson there from the Institute of Fiscal Studies.